It was Sarah's 28th birthday dinner at my ranch house in Frisco. My wife Margaret had been gone 18 months. That night, my son-in-law Derek Hayes slapped my daughter 3 times across the face just because she spilled iced tea on the patio table. His mother Linda stood up from her chair and started clapping. "That's how Texas women learn to behave," she said with a smile that chilled my blood. They thought their power could silence me. They thought I'd sit there and take it because I was just some retired old man grieving his wife. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I stood up, my hands shaking not from fear, but from 25 years of controlled rage built up from sitting on the family court bench, watching men like Derek destroy women like my Sarah. I pulled out my phone and made one call. What happened next? They never stopped screaming. Their whole world collapsed in handcuffs and courtroom testimony, all because they dared to hurt my daughter in front of me. My name is William Richardson, but everyone calls me Bill. I'm 59 years old, and I spent 25 years as a family court judge here in Collin County, Texas. I've seen every kind of domestic abuse case you can imagine: wealthy executives who controlled their wives' credit cards, church deacons who quoted scripture while blackening their wives' eyes, charming sociopaths who convinced entire communities that their victims were crazy. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me to watch my own daughter get beaten right in front of me by the man she called her husband. That night, after I called the Frisco Police Department and watched Derek Hayes being taken away in handcuffs, I sat in my home office trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. How had I, a man who had dedicated a quarter-century to recognizing the signs of abuse from the bench, missed them completely in my own family? The answer wasn't simple, but it started 18 months earlier when my world had already begun to collapse. My wife Margaret was a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and family therapy. She ran her practice right here in Frisco for 24 years, working out of a small office complex on Preston Road. Margaret was brilliant, had this uncanny ability to read people that made her one of the most respected therapists in North Texas. She could spot a manipulator from across a crowded church social, could sense deception in a handshake, could read the subtle signs of abuse that most people missed entirely. About 4 years ago, Margaret and I had dinner with our daughter Sarah and her new boyfriend Derek Hayes at our favorite barbecue place on Legacy Drive. It was one of those perfect Texas evenings in early fall, the kind that makes you grateful to live here. Sarah was glowing, happier than I'd seen her since her college graduation. Derek was everything a father might want for his daughter on paper. Successful car sales manager at a Ford dealership, charming personality, the kind of easy Texas confidence that made conversation flow naturally. Halfway through the meal, while Derek was telling us about his plans to move up to management, Margaret leaned over and whispered something in my ear that I should have taken more seriously. "There's something not right about that boy, Bill. Something calculated behind the charm." I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and squeezed my hand under the table. "I can't explain it exactly, but trust me on this one. Watch how he talks about other people when he thinks no one's paying attention." At the time, I brushed off Margaret's concern. Sarah was radiating happiness, laughing at Derek's stories, clearly head over heels in love. How could I question that kind of joy? Margaret was protective of Sarah, she always had been, and I figured she was just having trouble letting go. But Margaret wasn't wrong about people very often. In 24 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times her initial read on someone had been incorrect. They got married 2 years later at Preston Trail Community Church, the same church where Margaret and I had been married 26 years before. It was a beautiful ceremony. Sarah looking radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, Derek playing the role of the perfect husband-to-be. The reception was held at the country club where I'd been a member since my early days on the bench. Everyone commented on what a lovely couple they made, how lucky Sarah was to find such a successful, charming young man. I remember thinking that Margaret had been wrong about Derek. It was one of the few times in our marriage when her psychological instincts had led her astray. But Margaret passed away 18 months ago from a massive stroke while she was sleeping. The doctor said it was quick, that she didn't suffer. One moment she was there beside me, breathing softly in the pre-dawn darkness of our bedroom, and the next, she was gone. Just like that, the woman who could read people better than anyone I knew, who understood the psychology of relationships like nobody else, was no longer here to guide me. With Margaret's death, I lost not just my wife, but also my compass. The grief hit me like a freight train, knocking me completely off balance. I threw myself into my retirement activities, volunteering at the church, working in my garage, anything that could keep my mind off the emptiness in our 4-bedroom ranch house. The place that had once been filled with Margaret's laughter and wisdom now felt like a museum of memories that hurt too much to examine closely. During those months of overwhelming grief, I barely noticed when Sarah seemed to be pulling away from our family traditions. I was too absorbed in my own pain to see that she'd stopped coming to our Sunday golf games at the country club. I didn't register that she'd quit her marketing job at the real estate company where she'd been thriving and talking about starting her own consulting business. I didn't ask the right questions when she started wearing longer sleeves to church. Even as Texas spring turned to the blazing heat of summer, here I was, a former family court judge trained to spot patterns of control and abuse in other people's families, and I was blind to what was happening in my own. Sarah is 28 years old, smart, creative, a marketing coordinator with a mind that could sell ice to Eskimos. She inherited Margaret's ability to connect with people instantly and my stubborn determination to see things through to the end. When she was growing up, Margaret used to joke that Sarah got the best of both of us, my backbone and her people skills. Sarah had been thriving at her marketing job with a commercial real estate company on Legacy Drive. She'd been talking about launching her own consulting firm, had been saving money and building a client base on the side. She was the kind of young woman who made Margaret and me incredibly proud. Independent, ambitious, confident in her own abilities. But somewhere in the fog of my grief, that ambitious young woman had started disappearing, and I'd been too lost in my own pain to notice. At first, the changes seemed innocent enough. Sarah mentioned she'd stopped playing golf with me on Saturday mornings because Derek preferred they spend that time together working on house projects. She'd given up her Thursday night book club with her college sorority sisters, saying she wanted to prioritize her marriage. When I asked about it over Sunday dinner, she smiled that bright smile I remembered from her childhood and said, "Derek makes me so happy, Daddy. I just want to focus on being the best wife I can be." Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that Margaret would have caught immediately. The subtle changes in Sarah's vocabulary, the way she'd started asking Derek's permission for things she'd never needed permission for before. The gradual shift from "I think" to "Derek thinks" when she talked about everything from politics to where they should vacation. But I was drowning in my own grief, using work around the house and volunteer activities at church to avoid dealing with the massive hole Margaret's death had left in my life. Then came the more obvious red flags that I somehow managed to rationalize away. Derek started making comments about Sarah's appearance, her behavior, her independence. "Maybe you shouldn't wear that dress to the church social," he'd say when they came for Sunday dinner. "It's a little too revealing for a married woman." Or, "You talked too much during dinner with my colleagues last night, honey. Women should listen more and talk less in business situations." Sarah would laugh off his criticism, but I noticed she started dressing differently. More conservative, less like the confident young professional who used to wear power suits to client meetings. Her bright, colorful wardrobe gradually shifted to muted colors, longer hemlines, higher necklines. When I complimented her on a new outfit, she'd say things like, "Derek picked it out," or "Derek says this color looks good on me." The real warning bells should have gone off when Derek started talking about his mother. "My mom was going to move closer to us," he announced one Sunday afternoon while we were grilling hamburgers in my backyard. "She's been thinking about relocating to the Dallas area anyway since my stepfather passed. It'll be nice to have family nearby, especially for Sarah to have a mother figure to learn from." Sarah's smile tightened just slightly when Derek said this, but she nodded and agreed that it would be wonderful. That was when I should have paid closer attention. That was when I should have asked my daughter privately if everything was really okay. But I was still so wrapped up in missing Margaret that I missed the fear flickering behind Sarah's eyes. Linda Hayes arrived in Frisco like a tornado I didn't see coming. She was 62 years old, a widow who had raised Derek alone after his father died in what everyone believed was a hunting accident 11 years earlier. Within days of moving into a rental house just 6 blocks away from Derek and Sarah's place, she had a key to their house and was using it freely. Every morning brought her through their front door without knocking, without calling ahead, treating their home like it was her own personal domain. Linda would reorganize Sarah's kitchen cabinets, throw out her spice collection, and replace it with her own preferences, comment critically on everything from Sarah's cooking to her housekeeping to her choice of friends. "Those college girls of yours are a bad influence," Linda would tell Sarah. Married women don't need to be running around with single friends, getting ideas above their station. The skirts were always too short, the blouses too revealing, the makeup too heavy. The casseroles were too salty, the house wasn't clean enough, Sarah wasn't submissive enough. Nothing my daughter did was ever quite right according to Linda Hayes. And the worst part was that Derek agreed with everything his mother said. When Sarah tried to push back, even gently, Derek would immediately side with Linda. "Mama knows what she's talking about, honey," he'd say with that charming smile that had fooled me for so long. "She raised me right, and she's just trying to help you be the best wife you can be." Sarah would nod and retreat further into herself, her personality shrinking a little more each week. I noticed she stopped laughing during our family dinners. Her phone calls to me became shorter, more careful, like she was walking through a minefield with every word. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd give me that forced bright smile and say, "Just tired, Daddy. Marriage is an adjustment, you know." But I didn't know. Margaret and I had never had to navigate anything like what Sarah was going through. 10 months after Linda moved to Frisco, Derek hit Sarah for the first time. It started over something completely trivial. She'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning from the shop on Main Street. When he came home from the dealership and realized his favorite shirt wasn't ready for an important client meeting the next morning, something shifted in his face. The charming mask slipped, and I got my first glimpse of who Derek Hayes really was underneath all that Texas gentleman act. According to what Sarah told me months later, Derek said she was careless and disrespectful, that she didn't understand her responsibilities as a wife. "A good wife anticipates her husband's needs," he told her, his voice cold and controlled. "A good wife doesn't let her husband look unprofessional because she can't handle simple tasks." That's when he hit her for the first time. Just once, not hard enough to leave a visible mark, but hard enough for Sarah to understand that something fundamental had changed in their marriage. He apologized immediately afterward, of course, held her, told her he loved her more than anything in the world, said the stress of work and having his mother so close was getting to him. He bought her flowers the next day, 24 red roses, and took her to dinner at her favorite steakhouse in Legacy West. Sarah believed him. She wanted to believe it was a one-time thing, that the pressure of his new management position at the dealership and Linda's constant presence was just too much for him to handle. But it happened again 2 weeks later. The pattern became as predictable as Texas weather. Trigger, explosion, apology, gifts, temporary peace, then another trigger. Each time the reasons got more trivial and the violence slightly more severe. She wore the wrong outfit to church. She spoke out of turn during dinner with his colleagues. She used a tone he didn't like when she disagreed with something Linda said. She looked at another man for too long at the grocery store. And each time after Derek hit her, Sarah would search desperately for what she'd done wrong. She'd replay the moment in her head over and over, trying to figure out the exact combination of words and actions that would keep her safe. Maybe this really was her fault. Maybe she needed to be more careful, more aware, more obedient. Maybe she wasn't cut out for marriage the way other women were. Around the same time the physical abuse started, Sarah quit her marketing job. I suspect Derek demanded it, though she told me it was her own decision. "I want to focus on being a good wife," she said when she called to tell me. "Derek works so hard to provide for us, and I want to make sure our home is perfect for him." A woman at home is easier to control than one out in the world making her own money, seeing other people, thinking her own thoughts, remembering who she used to be. I should have asked more questions. I should have noticed that my brilliant daughter, the marketing coordinator who used to talk about changing the world one client at a time, had stopped talking about her dreams entirely. I should have seen that the confident young woman who used to debate politics with me over Sunday dinner had become someone who looked to her husband before expressing any opinion at all. The moment that finally broke through my grief-induced blindness came about 4 months ago. I was at their house for dinner, and Derek was running late from a management meeting at the dealership. While Sarah was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on pot roast, I went to get some napkins from the dining room sideboard. That's when I found it. Margaret's grandmother's silver jewelry box. The beautiful antique piece I'd given Sarah for her college graduation. The jewelry box was dented and damaged beyond repair, the delicate silver corners bent and twisted like someone had thrown it against a wall. Sarah saw me holding it and went pale as Texas cotton. "What happened to this?" I asked, running my fingers over the damaged silver, thinking about Margaret's grandmother who had brought it from Ireland over a century ago. Sarah didn't answer. She just looked away and started setting the table with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. I didn't press her for an explanation. I was still too lost in my own grief to push for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. I just put the jewelry box back in the sideboard and pretended I hadn't seen the damage. But that broken jewelry box stayed with me for weeks afterward. It felt like a message from Margaret herself, a signal that something was terribly wrong in my daughter's life. Margaret would have known what to do. She would have asked the right questions, created the safe space Sarah needed to tell the truth. She would have recognized the signs I was missing, would have acted to protect our daughter before it was too late. 4 months passed like that. Derek's rage intensifying, Sarah shrinking further into herself, Linda orchestrating it all from her rental house down the street. I started paying closer attention finally, but it felt like watching a disaster unfold in slow motion without knowing how to stop it. Every Sunday when they came for dinner, Sarah looked smaller, more fragile, more like a shadow of the vibrant young woman she'd once been. And then came that dinner on June 15th, Sarah's 28th birthday, the night that changed everything forever. June 15th, the day that changed everything forever. I remember every detail with the clarity that comes from witnessing something so shocking it burns itself into your memory permanently. That evening was Sarah's 28th birthday, and she'd invited me over for a barbecue dinner on their back patio. The weather was perfect, 87 degrees with a light breeze, the kind of Texas summer evening that makes you grateful to live in this great state. Sarah had grilled hamburgers and made her famous potato salad, the recipe Margaret had taught her when she was still in high school. Everything looked perfect on the surface. Fresh flowers on the patio table, citronella candles to keep the mosquitoes away, cold beer, and iced tea sweating in the humid air. But something felt wrong from the moment I walked through their back gate. The air felt tense and suffocating despite the warm weather. Sarah emerged from the kitchen wearing a long-sleeve blouse despite the June heat. Her hair was pulled back severely in a way that made her look older, more fragile. She moved carefully, like someone walking on eggshells, like someone who'd learned that sudden movements could trigger unexpected consequences. When she hugged me, I felt how thin she'd become, how her shoulder blades protruded through the fabric of her shirt. Derek and Linda were already seated at the patio table. Linda smiled with artificial warmth, commenting on the beautiful evening and asking about my retirement activities with the kind of false interest that made my skin crawl. Derek shook my hand firmly, his car salesman charm switched on like a neon sign. They were performing the role of the perfect family, but everything felt rehearsed, like actors who'd been practicing their lines. We began dinner with forced small talk. Linda dominated the conversation as usual, talking about her new house, her church activities, her opinions about everything from the neighborhood association to the local school board elections. Sarah barely spoke during the meal. She ate mechanically, her eyes fixed on her plate like she was afraid to look up and accidentally make eye contact with the wrong person at the wrong moment. Derek's hand occasionally reached for his beer bottle, and I noticed how Sarah's entire body tensed every time he moved. It was subtle, but after 25 years on the family court bench, I'd learned to recognize the body language of fear. I just hadn't expected to see it in my own daughter. Then it happened. Sarah was refilling everyone's iced tea from the pitcher she'd brought from the kitchen. Her hand trembled slightly. I understand now it was fear, not clumsiness, and a single drop of condensation fell from the bottom of the pitcher onto Derek's placemat. It was nothing, barely visible, the kind of minor spill that happens at every barbecue in Texas. But Derek's entire body went rigid like he'd been struck by lightning. "Do you see what you did?" he said quietly, his voice cold and controlled like a snake preparing to strike. "Can't you do anything right?" Sarah started to apologize, reaching for a napkin to clean up the tiny water spot. That's when Derek stood up from his chair with deliberate, calculated movements. What happened next took maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. His hand came up fast, connecting with Sarah's right cheek with a sound like a gunshot that echoed across the patio. The force of it snapped her head sideways and knocked her backward toward the table. Before she could even process what had happened, his hand came around again, harder this time, catching her left cheek with enough force to split her lip. I saw her eyes widen in shock and pain, saw the bright red mark blooming across her face like a terrible flower. Then came the third blow. The back of his hand across her face again, this time hard enough to knock her completely off balance. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand reaching blindly for something to steady herself. She hit the edge of the patio table and nearly fell, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth onto her white blouse. That's when Linda Hayes started clapping. Slow, measured applause like she was watching a performance at the community theater. "That's how she learns to behave," Linda said, her voice dripping with satisfaction and approval. "Texas women need to understand their place in the family hierarchy." In that moment, something inside me shifted completely. 25 years of being a family court judge, of maintaining professional distance and judicial objectivity, evaporated like morning fog. But I didn't scream or lunge across the table. Instead, I went absolutely silent for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. My mind, the part trained over 2.5 decades to understand restraining orders, evidence collection, witness testimony, activated automatically. I was taking inventory of everything I was seeing. The patio lights illuminating the scene perfectly, the way Linda smiled with genuine pleasure at my daughter's pain, the tremor in Sarah's hands as she touched her bleeding lip. The exact words both Derek and Linda had used. The time of day, the witnesses present, the clear evidence of assault. All of it would matter in court, and I knew it. I pulled out my phone with hands that were steady as granite. "I'm calling the police," I said in the quiet, professional voice I'd used from the bench for 25 years. Derek's arrogant expression cracked, his face going pale. Linda's applause stopped abruptly. "You're overreacting, old man," Derek said, but his confidence was already dissolving. She needed to learn some respect. 11 minutes, I told him, already dialing 911. That's exactly how long it takes Frisco PD to respond to domestic violence calls in this neighborhood. I suggest you both sit down, keep your mouths shut, and wait for the handcuffs. 11 minutes later, Sergeant Carlos Mendez walked through my back gate with 2 patrol officers. He took one look at the blood on Sarah's face, the fear in her eyes, and the casual cruelty radiating from Derek and Linda, and he immediately understood what he was dealing with. Derek and Linda Hayes were handcuffed, read their rights, and taken away in separate patrol cars. As they led Derek to the police car, he looked back at me with pure hatred. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said quietly. "This isn't over." I looked him straight in the eye and replied with the calm authority of someone who'd spent 25 years dealing with men exactly like him. "You're absolutely right about one thing, son. This is just getting started. What happened over the next 6 months proved that Derek Hayes had no idea who he was dealing with either. A retired family court judge with 25 years of experience, a network of law enforcement contacts throughout North Texas, and a daughter whose life was worth fighting for. By the time the legal system was finished with Derek and Linda Hayes, they both understood exactly what happens when you hurt the wrong man's family. Derek got 5 years in state prison for aggravated domestic violence. Linda got 15 years to life after we uncovered evidence that she'd murdered Derek's stepfather 11 years earlier for his $300,000 life insurance policy. Justice was served, the guilty were punished, and Sarah was finally free to rebuild her life. Today, 14 months later, Sarah is dating Michael Torres, a middle school teacher who treats her the way a woman deserves to be treated. She's laughing again, pursuing her dreams again, and most importantly, she's safe. Margaret would be proud of both of us. Sometimes protecting your family means knowing when to stop being polite and start being dangerous. My name is William Richardson. I'm 59 years old, and this is the true story of the night that changed everything and the justice that followed.